What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of the MBT movement. I'm your host, Sheldon, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about all things breath work. I'm going to be honest with you all. This is version 3 that I'm recording, and it's merely because I didn't realize how much information I had on this topic in itself. And really, the information we're going to talk about is just the tip of the iceberg. I had to break this up though into two parts. So this is going to be part 1, and then we're going to have a part 2 coming at you next week. Right? So part 1, we're going to talk about the problem. We're going to talk about the science of breath and why 91% of athletes are breathing wrong and what's actually going on. So this is essentially going to be covering the problem, why we're breathing wrong, and the science to what's actually happening. Where part 2, we're going to talk about some solutions here, covering the world's most powerful breathing philosophies and how to apply them. So let's start here. Let me ask you something. When's the last time you thought about how you breathe? Not just that you breathe. We all breathe. We all like, hey, I know how to breathe. But actually, how do you breathe? The quality of your breathing. And here's what's wild. You take somewhere between 20 to 25,000 breaths every single day, and that's over 7 million breaths a year. And most of us have never been taught how to do it properly. And to go further into this, breathing is the only autonomic function we can consciously control. We can't directly control heart rate, we can't control digestion, but we can control breath. And it's been shown that breath has a profound impact on these things that we aren't able to control, things like heart rate and digestion. Furthermore, the breath is a bridge between conscious and unconscious systems. Not just that, but a bridge between body and spirit, which is something we're going to talk about in part 2 as well. Ancient traditions knew this as well. Things like breath were central to practices such as yoga, martial arts, and meditation. In fact, recent research out of Japan found that 91% of competitive athletes, people who pride themselves on optimizing their bodies, 91% were found to have displayed dysfunctional breathing patterns. So if the best of the best are getting this wrong, what does that mean for the rest of us? That stat breakdown came out of a 2023 study from the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, where it studied baseball, tennis, basketball, badminton, and volleyball athletes, showing that only 9.4% showed proper diaphragmatic breathing patterns, where 61% were thoracic dominant breathers or chest breathers. I refer to this as secondary accessory breathers or breathing technique or breathing strategy. The highest dysfunction were actually found in middle school athletes. So this starts from habits earlier on in life, where 93% showed dysfunctional breathing patterns. So you might ask, where exactly did we lose functional breathing and become dysfunctional breathers? And research actually shows that at the age of 5 is where this starts to happen. It was mentioned in Dr. Belisa Vranich's book, Breathing for Warriors. She points out that prior to age 5, children demonstrate adequate diaphragmatic breathing techniques that are natural, without shame and without bracing. And if you watch a toddler breathe, you'll see that their belly rises and falls. It's perfect to the ideal strategy when we consider functional breathing. But after age 5, something happens. And by the time we're adults, most of us have completely lost this natural functional breathing strategy. And we can point the finger in any which direction, but objectively, we can clearly see that when we start to sit for longer periods of time versus spend time on the ground, this inhibits diaphragmatic function. Reason being is when we're sitting in chairs, when we're sitting at desks, right, we're vertically compressed and we become more vertical breathers, right, which is something that also Dr. Vranich mentions in her book, Vertical versus Horizontal Breathers, which we'll mention here shortly. Furthermore, the other piece of this for infants especially is being in car seats. So long car rides, short car rides, whatever the case might be, commuting in a vehicle requires them to be restrained in a car seat, which you say, okay, so what? Car seat, no big deal. But you think furthermore, the harness of the car seat creates significant compression and restriction against the diaphragm. So now we inhibit adequate diaphragmatic breathing strategies because of this. spending less time on the floor, where the floor is where we actually help optimize diaphragmatic mobility, right? Floor play is key to this. And floor play is not sleeping. When we're sleeping, we're passive and we're not actually rolling and thinking about how our connection to earth is when it pertains to our trunk, our low back, and our diaphragm sequences. The other piece here is imitating parents. Why children after the age of 5 demonstrate poor dysfunctional breathing patterns is because they want to imitate their parents. We become who we're around. It's a biopsychosocial phenomenon. And if we're around our parents, this is what we're going to learn the most from. So if they're always stressed, if they're always short breathers, short chesty breathers, this is what we learn to do in essence. The next piece here is imitating superheroes. So if you look at a lot of the toy stores and a lot of the toys on the shelves, you see G.I. Joes, Captain America's, whatever the case might be, broad shoulders, narrow belly, right? Narrow belly is the non-ideal diaphragmatic breathing stabilization strategy, because if we're breathing through our chest, we're vertical breathers versus, again, horizontal breathers, which Dr. Vranich mentions, horizontal breathers, big belly expansion, circumferential expansion through the diaphragm, through the trunk, not just that, but also through pelvic floor. Two other pieces here include stress and shame. So school pressures, social dynamics, performance anxiety. So people who are more in an anxious state or more hyperventilative, shallow breathers. So very short breathers, very timid, very in their mind, create a lot of tension versus bracing. And there's a difference in that as well. Shame being body image, the aesthetic image that society puts on us of how we should look. Sucking in the gut becomes habitual. And that's going to be the difference between a tense and a brace. When we're tense, most people, when I ask them to tense, what do they do? Or what's the first thing they think about doing? And I've asked this question time and time again. They say they want to suck in their gut, which again is the non-ideal stabilization or diaphragmatic strategy here. When we suck in our gut, we inhibit the diaphragm and we become verticalized breathers, where we're breathing through our chest, through our neck, through our accessory muscles, which now become primary respiratory muscles, which is not what they're meant to do. So in essence, tension, guarding, and sucking in is not what we want to do when we think about an ideal breathing strategy utilizing the diaphragm. By adulthood, we've trained away our natural breathing pattern, where now this 91% stat makes sense. And if we've had decades of dysfunctional practice, we have to basically unbind that knot of decades of life experience of dysfunctional breathing. But the good news here is if you could do it at age 3, you can relearn it. So a 2024 study published in the Scientific Reports examined elite endurance athletes and found that diaphragmatic breathing patterns were associated with significant pulmonary function, better spirometry values, better lung capacity, better oxygen diffusion. And with athletes who demonstrated dysfunctional breathing, they're at higher risk for musculoskeletal injuries, decreased performance, and chronic issues like low back and neck pain. And these are things we have to be thinking about. If dysfunctional breathing has been linked to low back pain, neck pain, and shoulder pain, we can understand that the diaphragm is basically a powerhouse to create circumferential trunk rigidity and stability. So if we think about something like javelin throwing or throwing a ball, whatever the case might be, throwing something, there is a ground reaction force of our feet making contact with the ground, that force being transmitted up into our leg through our trunk. And if we don't have a proper stabilization strategy through our trunk, or we're chest breathers, we essentially lose the power. There's a power leakage happening at our trunk where we can't fully transmit the force through our upper extremity so that we can propulse the javelin, the baseball, whatever the case might be, into its final destination. So huge power leakage if we're not using proper circumferential diaphragmatic stabilization. And I like to use this scene from the original, like one of the redos of the Planet of the Apes, where the main ape, he has this one stick and he says, apes alone. He breaks the stick in half and he says, weak. And then he gets a bunch of twigs and he says, apes together, strong. And this is the same idea here. You can watch the scene. He breaks the twig. The other guy's like, whoa, no, don't do that. We don't want to be weak. We want to be strong. He says, apes together, puts the branches together, and he tries to break it. He says, strong. When you create the systems together as one whole kinetic chain, Again, ground reaction force, create the force from the ground through our foot into our leg. We have a strong stabilized trunk. So now we can connect those systems from lower to upper. We have no power leakage and we're creating the most force through the javelin, through the ball, whatever the case might be. So these are the systems working together in essence. And I've used this video to create analogies of many other different types of subject matter. But when it comes to breath, right, we have to understand the kinetic chain, the sequence, the fascial system is integrative to how we incorporate posture, respiration, and performance. So poor breathing has also been linked to poor trunk stability, creates compensatory patterns, and creates injury. So if we think about the secondary accessory breathing strategy where we're breathing through our chest, right? So accessory muscles include pec minor, serratus anterior, scalenes, neck muscles, upper traps, these sorts of things that help verticalize ourselves. So this is why it's called vertical breathing, because if I'm using this secondary accessory strategy, what happens is you see a lot of verticalization in the upper body and the torso versus horizontal breathers. Shoulders are very relaxed. You see circumferential expansion through the belly, lateral, posterior lateral, that is through the back, as well as down through the pelvic floor. And if we think about anatomical structures, the ribs and the pelvis here, this is going to be a nice neutral alignment, right? We can even just use a sternum here even. Whereas we have this nice neutral curvature of the spine, slight lordosis in the lumbar, slight kyphosis in the thoracic is what we want to create that natural S-curve. And in a lot of society, you look at people from a side angle, they have almost extreme curvature. So the hips are dumped into an anterior pelvic tilt and the ribs are bucked up. You're in a it's almost like kyphotic lordosis is almost what you're creating. And what happens now is we create what's known as an open scissors pattern, right? So the ribs are bucked up, the hips are bucked down. And now if you think about the point of convergence, it's going to be that lumbar. So now the low back has significant compression against that posterior or the back aspect of the spine. No wonder why people have low back pain, because the posture isn't optimized. And now if we think about how the diaphragm expands, so if we added on the diaphragm here, the diaphragm is a direct connection to the rib cage. If the rib cage is bucked forward, the diaphragm runs out of space through the front abdominal wall. So if you think about the six-pack, the diaphragm is basically running into the upper four-pack here, and now it has no space to go. Whereas we want a neutral orientation of the rib cage stacked over the pelvis such that the diaphragm can distend down into abdominal wall via the central tendon and the expansion of the diaphragm through the abdominal cavity. Not just that, the diaphragm distends even down into pelvic floor. So we create full 360 degrees of expansion. And when we have the expansion through the torso via the diaphragm, one, we have nice stability through the torso. Two, the diaphragm compresses the spine and creates stability. So you think about this from a performance standpoint. If I'm doing a heavy deadlift, it would behoove me not to use this strategy to create the most stability against the spine. There's going to be a balance between stability and mobility. But when I'm getting into the upper threshold of lifting a ton of weight or exerting a significant amount of force, I best make sure I have adequate amount of stability based on the given tasks. So if I'm rolling jujitsu and I got to put a lot of force to toss a guy, or if I got to lift a heavy deadlift, or if I'm doing a heavy snatch or clean and jerk, whatever the case might be, I'm exerting a high amount of force. I need adequate stability so that there's no slippage in my joints and so that structures are not overworking. So in terms of diaphragmatic stabilization strategy, if I use this strategy here, my low back is not going to be screaming at me after I just tossed a guy or after I just pulled up 500 pounds off the ground, because my paraspinals, those are your low back muscles. So I'm going to put some layers on here. So for those of you who are listening to the podcast, just note, you can see the video version on my school community. I'm going to give a shout out at the end of the podcast here, but I have my anatomy app here and it's showing the back. You have basically two sets of muscles along your spine. They're called your paraspinals. And I have a good acronym for this. It's called I love spaghetti. So if you go from the outside, that's your iliocostalis, in the medial, in the middle, it's going to be your longissimus, and in the most inner side of the muscles closest to the spine, that's going to be your semispinalis, right? ILS, I love spaghetti. That's the acronym. You have one set of muscles on each side of your spine. These are your primary spinal erectors, and these are the muscles that get fried out if you're not using a proper diaphragmatic stabilization strategy for exerting force. So these are things that we got to be thinking about, all right? But now we take it back to injury prevention. And if we don't have proper breathing patterns, if we don't have proper posture, it creates a more foundational understanding as to how we compensate, because compensations are basically the brain's way of making up slack for what the body should be doing, right? And I like to say, if you think about like a building full of guide wires, if one guide wire is pulling too much or not pulling enough, it throws the whole system off. And if you look at Tom Meyer's body of work through anatomy trains and how he has the tensegrity model, this is that same idea, is we need to have length and tension in each structure sufficient to the whole system, as it's all integrative. And if not, we create compensations, and compensations, whether in the short term or long term, will inevitably lead to injury. So breathing is a direct relation to posture, and we have to understand that they're inseparable. And this isn't just about performance, it's about pain-free longevity and sustainable training habits. This is part one of a two-part series I'm calling the Breath Blueprint. And today I'm going to break down the science of breath, what's actually happening in your body, why nasal breathing matters, why carbon dioxide tolerance is the hidden key most people miss, and why your diaphragm is what Dr. Vranich refers to as the pneumatic hub of your entire body. And in part two, again, we're going to go into the world's most powerful breathing philosophies, from ancient pranayama to Navy SEAL tactical breathing. And I'll show you exactly how I integrate all of this at MBT. So before we get into the philosophies, let's talk about the machinery. Belisa Branich, in her book, Breathing for Warriors, dropped some stats that blew my mind. You have 10 pounds of breathing muscles in your body, and that's not insignificant. Those muscles are moving about 3,000 gallons or 11,000 liters in and out of your body every single day. So 10 pounds of breathing muscles. This includes your diaphragm. It will also include your pelvic floor. Include your intercostals. Those are going to be the muscles that directly attach to your rib cage. It's going to be your abdominals. Not to forget your accessory muscles as well. So these accessory muscles include your serratus anterior, include your pec minor, include your scalenes, your upper traps. All these muscles collectively are what's used to create functional respiration. And again, 3,000 gallons or 11,000 liters per day, right? Think about the work that represents in totality, right? These are trainable muscles, and most people never train them deliberately. You think about the conventional ways that people train in the gym. You can train your legs, your arms, your back. You can get a bro sesh, swole sesh, whatever you want to call it. But when is the last time they deliberately trained breathing muscles? And research shows up to 50% of athletes are prone to diaphragmatic fatigue during exercise. And Vranich calls a diaphragm the pneumatic hub of the body. And if you think about that, a pneumatic hub, right, it's not just breathing muscles. And to take this a step further, you know how I mentioned the intercostals, those muscles that attach to the rib cage? Every time you breathe in and you use a proper diaphragmatic strategy, the ribs expand and contract. So this is part of that pneumatic function that we talk about. It's central to trunk stability, your posture, your ability to generate and transmit force and power. And here's the problem. Adults over time shift from healthy diaphragmatic breathing to upper chest or thoracic breathing, something again I refer to as secondary accessory breathing strategy. We sit at desks, we hunch over our phones, and we stress out, and our breathing moves up the body. Vranich calls this, again, vertical breathing versus horizontal breathing, where you want to have belly expansion with the relaxed shoulders. And this shift changes everything. Expanding on the pneumatic hub, the diaphragm connects to the spine, the ribs, and internal organs, and it works synergistically with the pelvic floor. They move together. The diaphragm is also central to intra-abdominal pressure or true trunk stability. And if we go back to what I just said a few sentences ago, the connection of the diaphragm to the spine, ribs, and internal organs, this is the pump effect that we can create. Every time we inhale and the diaphragm expands, it compresses our belly, it compresses our intestines, and creates basically that pump effect. And when we exhale, everything relaxes and we recreate that space. The diaphragm also has a direct effect to the vagus nerve tone, which is known to modulate the parasympathetic response. Within our autonomic nervous system, we have sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic, fight, flight, freeze. Parasympathetic, rest, digest, and relaxation. And if we compare vertical breathing to horizontal breathing, we know that vertical breathing is going to lead to things like the shoulders rising, the neck muscles engaging, and the chest moving up. This is that secondary breathing strategy. Where horizontal breathing, again, shoulders should be relaxed, the belly should expand circumferentially, the ribs are expanding outward as we inhale and compressing inward as we exhale. Main thing here is we're not using the accessory muscles as primary respiratory muscles. Thoracic flexibility and lung volume peak at age 29. So if we have dysfunctional breathing for decades, we know that thoracic flexibility and peak lung volume are going to be stifled and inhibited. Doesn't mean that we can't work on this, but it's going to be more of an uphill battle because we have this dysfunctional breathing pattern that has been so long ingrained into our psyche, and it's going to require proactive work. A simple test to see how you're breathing, if you're functionally breathing, you just place one hand on your belly and one hand on your chest. Not stacked one over the other, but you have one hand over your belly button and one hand over your heart. And you're just going to basically pay attention to where you're breathing. Don't even try to change your breathing pattern. All you're going to do right now is just pay attention to where you're breathing. Are you feeling the breath expand in the belly hand, or are you feeling it expand in the chest hand? If it's the belly hand, more likely you're going to be demonstrating a functional or a diaphragmatic breathing strategy. If you're feeling the chest hand expand, this is an accessory breathing strategy, which is going to be less than ideal. We do also have a hybrid breathing strategy. Again, this isn't going to be ideal because we really want to feel diaphragmatic expansion. So you say, oh, okay, well, don't my ribs expand when I breathe, so shouldn't I feel my chest expand? Yes, but first, the diaphragm has to expand down into the belly before the ribs start to expand. When I inhale, and if my chest is expanding already, we can say, sure, maybe the ribs are expanding, but again, my neck tone is probably going to be more upregulated, and I'm probably going to have more accessory muscles turned on with this strategy. So really feeling the belly expand is going to be key here. Next, we're going to talk about the nasal breathing advantage in James Nestor's body of work, where he wrote the book Breath, The New Science of a Lost Art, and actually participated in a Stanford study where he plugged his nose for 10 days and was forced to breathe only through his mouth. Within 3 days, he developed sleep apnea. His snoring went from almost nothing to 4 hours a night. His blood pressure spiked, and his stress hormones went through the roof. When he switched back to nasal breathing, it all reversed. So this 10-day experiment, the results, again, were his sleep apnea developed almost immediately. His snoring went from 0 to 4 hours per night. His blood pressure increased significantly. Heart rate variability dropped. And that is an objective stress marker that we can look at. Heart rate variability is essentially beat-to-beat variability. So if you looked at an echocardiogram, you'll see each heartbeat. In between each heartbeat, there is going to be a certain amount of time beat to beat. What we like to see is more variability between heartbeats because that shows how well the heart can accommodate based on the stress and the environment that it's in. More variability means that your heart is able to fluctuate and accommodate based on its environment. Lower heart rate variability means that your heart doesn't have as much resiliency or bounce back or adaptability based off of the task that you're doing. So these are going to be highly objective stress markers that we can look at. Not just that, the 10-day experiment also revealed increased cortisol levels, which is the stress hormone. And he also developed a bacterial infection in his nasal cavity because he was not using his nose for breathing. This was all reversed, by the way, when he went back to nasal breathing within days. And this wasn't genetic. He didn't have any diseases. It was just 10 days of mouth breathing. And why does this happen? It goes further because your nose has things that your mouth simply can't do. There's a structure in your skull known as the nasal concha. This powerful tool that we have innately within our skull is going to naturally humidify the air to 95% humidity. Not just that, the nasal concha is also going to filtrate the air so that we're not taking in those pathogens. And here's the big one. Your paranasal sinuses produce nitric oxide. Research by Dr. John Lundberg at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden showed that nitric oxide opens up blood vessels, improves blood flow to your lungs, and even reduces pulmonary vascular resistance. One study found that nasal breathing alone increased arterial oxygenation by 18% compared to mouth breathing. So, what the nose does, again, it filters particulates and pathogens. It warms air to body temperature. It humidifies the air to 95% humidity, and it produces nitric oxide within the paranasal sinuses. Some of the benefits of nitric oxide include vasodilation, so it opens up blood vessels. It's antimicrobial, where it kills bacteria and viruses. It improves oxygen delivery to tissues, and that's part of the vasodilation effect. Vasodilation, think of it like we're adding on 3 lanes to the highway, where vasoconstriction is taking that wide highway to 1 lane. Big difference here. Not just that, nitric oxide has been shown to have an 11% reduction in pulmonary vascular resistance with nasal breathing. And something like humming increases nasal nitric oxide by 15-fold, again, studied by Dr. Lundberg. So now we're going to dive into the carbon dioxide connection with Patrick McGowan's body of work with the oxygen advantage. And here's where it gets counterintuitive. Patrick McGowan, author of The Oxygen Advantage and trained in the Buteyko method, teaches the real driver of your breathing isn't oxygen, it's carbon dioxide. Most of us are already at 95 to 90% oxygen saturation, and the problem isn't necessarily getting more oxygen in, it's getting oxygen released from your blood to your tissues and organs. And what determines that release? Carbon dioxide, which is also known as the Bohr effect. Further explained, the Bohr effect is where hemoglobin carries oxygen to the blood. And for oxygen to release to the tissues, there must be adequate carbon dioxide. If we have low carbon dioxide, which is demonstrated in overbreathers, oxygen stays bound to hemoglobin, where adequate carbon dioxide has been shown to release oxygen to muscles, brains, and organs. The paradox here is that breathing more can actually mean less oxygen to tissues. And it's because carbon dioxide is a vasodilator where it helps to open blood vessels. But carbon dioxide also affects brain oxygenation, where low carbon dioxide reduces blood flow to the brain. The paradox here is that breathing more can actually mean less oxygen to tissues, where, again, carbon dioxide is a vasodilator, so it helps to open up blood vessels, and carbon dioxide also affects brain oxygenation. So if we have low carbon dioxide, that means that we're going to have reduced blood flow to the brain because, again, oxygen is staying bound to the hemoglobin. So going back into Patrick McGowan's body of work with the oxygen advantage, he developed something known as the BOLT score, which is a body oxygen level test. It's a very simple test that can measure your sensitivity to carbon dioxide. And it demonstrates that if your BOLT score is under 20, you're probably a chronic overbreather, where the goal is to get up to 40 seconds. And the practical takeaway is that by training carbon dioxide tolerance through light nasal breathing and breath holds, you can improve endurance, reduce breathlessness, and even have stimulating effects equivalent to altitude training legally, safely, and for free. So if you're asking, okay, Sheldon, how do I do this BOLT score thing? Really simple here. All you're going to do is you're going to take a normal breath in, you're going to take a normal breath out, and then you're going to pinch your nose. You're going to hold your breath for the amount of time where you have that initial hunger for air, right? So air hunger is going to be that one primary indicator to dictate how long you hold your breath. When you finish this, you shouldn't feel like you're needing to gasp for air. If you did, you held your breath too long. So again, one breath in, one breath out, pinch your nose, hold your breath for the amount of time where you get that initial urge to take a breath of air, and then just breathe normally. That amount of time is going to be your BOLT score. So the scores explained are that if you're under 10 seconds, it shows that you have significant breathing dysfunction. If you're within 10 to 20 seconds, you have room for improvement. To 30 seconds, you're moderately functional, but you can improve. 30 to 40 seconds is good, where 40 plus seconds is excellent, and it shows that you have optimal carbon dioxide tolerance. Perfect example here of an elite level athlete is Jay Weisner of the Auburn Tigers. He went from a BOLT score of 13 30 in 3 weeks. So it goes to show how simple, consistent practice with something like just working on a BOLT score can have a profound impact on your carbon dioxide tolerance, which is going to have an effect on oxygen delivery to the body. So now we're going to go into the vagus nerve connection. And here's where the science gets really interesting. You might ask, why do all these breathing techniques work? And it comes down to the vagus nerve. You can see here in the screen share, this pink highlighted structure is going to be the vagus nerve, and it's the longest cranial nerve in your body. It runs from your brainstem all the way down through your neck, your heart, your lungs, and into your gut. And here's the key. It's a two-way street. Your brain sends signals down through the vagus nerve to calm your organs, but your organs can also send signals up to your brain. And the breath is the primary way we hack that bottom way up. So expanding on the vagus nerve, vagus literally means wanderer in Latin. It wanders through the body and it controls the parasympathetic rest, digest, and relaxation response, where higher vagal tone has been shown to have better stress resiliency, faster recovery, and improved heart rate variability, where lower vagal tone has been linked to anxiety, depression, inflammation, and poor digestion. Now you might ask, okay, well, how does the breath stimulate the vagus nerve? Well, first, long, slow exhales activate the vagal response. Diaphragmatic breathing, where diaphragmatic movement directly stimulates the vagus nerve. Nasal breathing, where nasal airflow directly activates vagal pathways, and breath holds, such as post exhalation holds, create a stronger vagal tone response. And every breathwork technique we're going to talk about in part 2 will all work through the vagus nerve. But breath isn't the only way to stimulate the vagus nerve. There are several powerful techniques that, when combined with breathwork, create an even greater effect. For instance, humming and chanting. This is very big because vibration in the throat via the vocal cords help to stimulate the vagus nerve. This is almost like a natural vagus nerve stimulation type of technique that can be used. Remember, the humming also has been shown to increase nitric oxide production by 15%. So increased nitric oxide, increased vasodilation, increased vagal tone response. These are all good things that can come out of something as simple as humming or chanting. And this is why the Om chanting that you hear in a lot of meditations, when they go Om, has been used for thousands of years. That Om creates the vibration from the vocal cords to stimulate the vagus nerve. In addition to this, gargling vigorously also works. So if you're gargling mouthwash, gargle it for 15 seconds or whatever the case might be. This will also help as the vagus nerve runs past the throat. Another concept here is cold exposure, something you're probably familiar with if you follow Wim Hof's body of work. Cold water helps to activate the dive reflex, which is massive for vagal response. In addition to this, cold showers, face dunking, or even cold washcloths can yield benefit from this technique. Again, diving back to Wim Hof's method, he combines both breathwork and cold exposure, which has that much more of an amplified response. Massages with breathwork. So if you're doing something like carotid sinus massages, foot massages, gentle neck shoulder massages, or even a self-massage over the ears, you can have a significant impact on the vagus nerve by these simple techniques. And even within a social connection sense, the vagus nerve is the social engagement nerve. And this is why breathwork in community hits differently. You have the community impact, you have the face-to-face conversation, the laughter, the whole experience in culmination to have that effect on the vagus nerve. And this is something that I use at MBT. I like to stack breathwork with movement and community. And again, this will have an impact on vagal tone. So bringing this together, we created an understanding that the problem is 91% of athletes, and honestly, probably the most of us, have breathing dysfunctionality. We lose our natural diaphragmatic breathing at around the age of 5, and decades of sitting, stress, and sucking the gut in only perpetuate this problem. We've covered the science and know that you have 10 pounds of breathing muscles moving nearly 3,000 gallons of air daily. We know that your diaphragm is the pneumatic hub of your body, central to trunk stability, posture, and power. And we know that nasal breathing produces nitric oxide that increases oxygenation by 18%. Furthermore, carbon dioxide tolerance, not just oxygen, is the real key to performance, which explains why the Bolt test matters. So I'm really looking forward to next week in part 2 because we're going to get deeper into the solutions. I'm going to break down the world's most powerful breathing philosophies, from ancient pranayama practices that are over 5,000 years old to Navy SEAL tactical breathing to the Russian Special Forces methodology known as Systema, where they integrate 4 pillars, to therapeutic modalities like holotropic and rebirthing breathwork. And I'll show you exactly how I've integrated all of this into my MBT approach and why breathing is the number one pattern in my primate framework. So definitely tune in for that episode because you're not going to want to miss this. But here's what I want you to do before next week. Try out the Bolt test. Tomorrow morning, maybe before you get out of bed or before your coffee, before you get on the phone, take a normal breath in, exhale, and then pinch your nose and record that amount of time before you feel that first urge to take your breath. And what I want you to do is I want you to drop your number in the school community. I'm going to create a post. If you're not already a part of it, check out my free school community, school.com/movement-based therapy. I'll have a post in there talking about a Bolt score. I want you to try it out and let me know what your score is. We're all starting from somewhere, and when part 2 drops, you'll have your baseline a lot more clearly. So if this episode resonated with you, again, come join us. Check us out at the MBT community on School. School.com, that's SKOOL.com/movement-based therapy, where we go deeper into topics like this. I'll share breathing drills and progressions, and you can ask questions to me and the community directly. The link's going to be in the show notes. It's free and it's where the conversation continues. So drop your Bolt score in there this week. Furthermore, within the school community, you get a few exclusive perks. This podcast is both audio and video. The audio format you can find on all streaming podcast platforms, whether it's YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or any major podcast distribution platform. If you're looking for the video podcast, though, you can find that exclusively on my school community. I post it in there. In addition to that, you can also have a reference citation sheet that I provide to each episode exclusive within the school community. So that's it for part 1. Remember, your body is capable of more than you think. You knew how to breathe perfectly once, and all we're doing here is we're just helping you how to remember. So honor your body, restore the flow, and I'll see you in part 2.